Hi, Tiffany. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm excited to be on your podcast.
Me too. Thank you so much for being on here and taking the time. So I met Tiffany through this TikTok portal where we are both creators for TikTok, and they shared her story on the meeting. And I had to reach out to her. I looked at her videos, followed her on Instagram, and I've been educating myself because I want to be more inclusive of not just diversity in races, but of everybody, of abilities, orientations, and everyone in between. So I really wanted to have Tiffany on, and she's also an Asian American woman who is representing a whole bunch of us who haven't had a model to look up to. So welcome, Tiffany.
Thank you.
So let's start from your origin story. Where are you from? Where did you grow up?
Sure. And I love origin stories. So I am the daughter of a Taiwanese immigrant and a refugee from the Vietnam War. And I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area. And I always think it's important to talk about my Asian origins because that actually really heavily influenced a lot of things that happened later in my life. So that is the original origin story. And then I often talk about how many of us who do have disabilities have a disability origin story. And so my disability origin story, at the age of 9, I became disabled as a result of a car accident that also took the life of my dad. And so my arm was permanently paralyzed. And the reason why I wanted to bring both of these origin stories together is because so much of the way that I was raised and influenced by being the daughter of Asian immigrants really had an enormous impact on how I viewed my disability, how I viewed death in the family, and how I viewed the car accident, which was trauma, and how much we could or couldn't share about what had happened. So I ended up spending, and I don't know if you saw this in the TikToks and other stuff like that, I didn't tell anyone about the car accident for 12 years. And I wore long sleeves all the time to try and hide my arm. I tried to hide my disability. And I told everyone that my dad was away on a trip because I didn't want to acknowledge or feed into the taboo or the potential ill fate I would put onto my family by saying that this shameful thing had occurred.
So did you grow up in a household where you didn't feel safe to share your feelings or what you were going through at the time?
I love that you brought up this word safe because I think it is something that I am still working through because what I'm noticing, right? And again, a lot of how we're raised really influence our intimate partner relationships. And yes, I think the short version of the answer is I had no outlets. I had no support system. And what I will often tell people is that my mom is a hero because her husband passed away. 3 out of her 4 kids were in the car. All 3 of us survived. And she was left to raise 4 young children on her own with what I am perceiving as very limited support. And so what she did was, maybe this is immigrant mentality. She worked really hard. So I never had to worry about if I had a place to sleep or if I had food on the table or if I'd have access to education, right? That level of basic needs. But there was an enormous part of this, which is emotional needs that weren't met, right? And oftentimes I think back and I'm like, if I could go back, I wouldn't change anything because of course it made me who I am today and really inspired so much of the work I do. But it just would have been nice if someone had asked me how I was.
Yeah.
And because I never had that invitation into that, that's, I think, where my first initial feelings around safety or lack thereof came to be. And so I grew up with the messaging, whether it was overt or not, that I needed to take care of myself and that I was the only person who could care for myself.
Oh, you're activating a lot of things within me as you were saying that because I grew up in a similar environment from what you're describing because my parents are also immigrants to this country, and there was no doubt that I would have something to eat and a safe place to stay. But yeah, same, never asked if you were okay or how are you feeling, or so I relate to that in a deep level. Whew. So you mentioned that you hid your disability for 12 years. And when was it the moment that you were just like, fuck this? Like, take off the sleeve.
Yeah. So I want to acknowledge that it's a journey. And I think oftentimes, I've done a handful of podcasts. People just want to know like that turning point, when did the switch flip? And honestly, there was a turning point, but I think it was all of these little seeds that were being planted along the way. So interestingly enough, on TikTok now, I've been getting a lot of questions from people who have disabilities who want to better understand how I talk about my disability when I'm dating. Mm-hmm. And that's another conversation, but the switch happened in 2009. I still remember it was October 22nd, 2009. And I was a senior in college and had just finished this summer internship in investment banking. Mm-hmm. And I bring up the summer internship because every single week you could go in and meet with the recruiter, and she would give you feedback that my team members were giving to HR that could then be relayed to me in like an anonymous way. And I remember walking out of one of those feedback sessions, and she said, "Tiffany, I want you to know that you deserved your place here. You don't need to feel like you have a chip on your shoulder." And it was a call out, it was a little bit of a call out. And in that moment, honestly, that was the first time that I felt seen. Someone saw me, and they saw how invisible I was trying to make myself. Mm-hmm. And she was saying, and this is how I internalized, she was saying, "I see you. And I want you to know that you're here. You don't need to try and downplay the experiences that led you to this place." And it's funny because, now it's been over 10 years since that internship, and it was investment banking, but at the time, I'd put so much pressure on myself, again, like daughter of Asian immigrants, like want to succeed, want to get that internship. And when I went back to school, I started to get really curious about what other areas of my life I was trying to make myself invisible. And so leading up to this October 22nd date, I had been invited to speak on a student panel around disability. And I had never really done that much in the space before, nor did I even know how to talk about my story in a way where I wasn't framed as a victim. Mm-hmm. So I remember the first time sharing the story of the car accident, I cried. There was still so much pain in there. And, now it's been 12 years of sharing this story that, I think about the reason why I brought up the dating thing is back in the day, in my early days of dating, I would wait until like the fourth date to tell someone about the car accident, right? And I think about this whole idea of like, what are we hiding and what shame is underneath there? Mm-hmm. Because now, and I just recorded the video, it might go live today. And I was like, okay, here's how I talk about my disability when I'm dating. I say, I paralyzed my arm in a car accident. And that's literally it, right? But in order to get to this point of just having it be a sentence, right, and roll off of my tongue, like that definitely took a journey.
And just out of curiosity, I'm kind of skipping around here. Why do you feel you have to say it? Is it because they're going to ask you anyway, or it's like the elephant in the room? Like, I kind of see it as, people coming out, saying that they're gay. In my mind, and I'm not gay, so I don't know that history, I don't know that story, but why do we even have to announce that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. And I spent a lot of time thinking about this as well. And I was talking to a friend earlier about how when we don't name these things that have played such an impactful role in our lives and the lens through which we move about the world, and we say, oh, like we're all human, we're all people. But I've had experiences of being a woman, of being Asian, of being disabled, that people treat me a certain way because I hold those identities. And so part of it is, I don't want to catfish anyone. Some people aren't comfortable with the physical manifestation of my disability, and that's okay, right? And in a way, it's for me saying, And it's not being like, here's all my trauma. Like, are you willing to make space for it? It's saying, hey, I want to let you know that I have experiences. I've done tons of work on it. I've been through my own healing process to move from victim to survivor to thriver. And I just want you to know that this is a part of my experience. And so what's interesting is, I mean, even on the dating apps, and so this is also tied in with my work at Diversibility too, right? So oftentimes people will always ask, the first question is, how did you get interested in this work? Right? Because I have what's called non-disabled passing privilege. So if I didn't tell you about my arm coming onto this podcast, or for your listeners or for your watchers, then you might not know. And you'd be curious, why does Tiffany care so much about disability? Could it be a family member? Is it a non-visible disability? Things like that. So I think for me, not only in my personal life, but also in my work, I think that part of the reason why maybe we don't name these things immediately is rooted in shame. And I refuse to feel shame about something that the universe gifted me to be part of my body and part of my experience.
Yeah. So this next question, I was thinking about when I was like preparing our session today, like the reason why your disability is so at the forefront of your experience is because it's physical and people can see it. A lot of us have these disabilities within where you can't see like, and for me, it's a part of my story too. It's a part of my healing journey, my trauma, all the things that I've experienced. And for a really long time, I would also say that, I would say, oh, I have these like horrible daddy issues. I went through so much trauma, abuse, and violence. And then at a certain point, it was like, I didn't want to attach myself to that identity. I didn't want to keep saying what I was in the past, because I don't think that healing ever stops, but I wanted to not identify myself with that identity. So I'm just curious with your own experience, because it's so physical, like, that's the reason why you think it's so much at the forefront of your experience?
I think that's a great question. So in addition to my brachial plexus injury, that's the name of the type of paralysis that I have, I was also diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, in 2019. So that's 22 years after the car accident. They realized that my triggers and the things that were happening were related to that. And I would argue that I actually feel like having PTSD influences more of my life than the physical, than my arm. And so I have been very careful to make sure that people know that I have both visible and non-visible aspects of my disability. I think part of the reason why it is at the forefront for me is because what I have learned is that by being visible and vocal about both of my disabilities, I have noticed that people feel like they have permission, or, the safe space to start to share their own experiences. And I think that we have so many antiquated views of what we think disability looks like, that even if I didn't have my arm, I think there was a very large treatment gap between when my trauma happened and when I was diagnosed with PTSD. But I needed the diagnosis in order to realize that something was wrong and that I needed treatment. And so I was actually able to get treatment for my PTSD, and I haven't had a trauma trigger or a severe trauma trigger in the past 2 years, right? So I often tell people that I actually feel like through this healing journey that I've been on related to the trauma, because I named it and I knew that there was a pathway to treatment and healing, that I'm actually potentially on my way to post-traumatic growth. I think there's some emerging research around that. So hopefully that sheds a little bit more light on it. But I think I think one of my therapists said to me, he said, the only way out is through. And I think that oftentimes when we suppress or we're not willing to acknowledge non-visible disabilities, it exacerbates them. It kind of like makes them bigger in a way. Actually, my most recent TED Talk, this might be more relevant for you. My latest TED Talk is called The Problem with Positivity.
Yes, I wanted to talk about that.
And I talked about how I did a lot of research and I became fascinated by toxic positivity because it's so rampant now. I think people are starting to realize it's a thing. And when we feed into toxic positivity, right, going around saying that nothing's wrong because we look able-bodied, right? What it ends up doing is ends up exacerbating whatever is happening inside of our body, and it makes it bigger.
Yeah.
So my hope is, 70% of disabilities are non-visible.
Mm.
And I would love to see, and I am starting to see, more people who have non-visible disabilities starting to speak up and take up space. And I want to see even more people with non-visible disabilities start to take up that space as well. Because I think what you're doing, Laura, you know, and again, like, I don't want to be the car accident for the rest of my life, right? And so that's why, you know, when I first shared the story of the car accident, it used to be 10 minutes. Mm-hmm. Now it's just a sentence, mm-hmm. right? And it's like, how can we reframe our stories by honoring the things that have happened to us, but knowing that it doesn't need to be the 10-minute story. It can literally just be the sentence.
Yeah, I love what you just said, because once I started my healing journey, because I was getting out of that toxic positivity, because clearly that doesn't last for very long. And I realized that all of the things that I went through actually gave me the power to speak out and then help other people who might have experienced the same kind of experience as me and help them through that healing journey. And I realized that a lot of women, a lot of people have this experience. They just don't talk about it because it's, again, shame. There's a lot of cultural things involved with it. But I do want to talk about the problem with positivity, because you did do a TED Talk on it, and it was your third TED Talk. And I find in the spiritual and wellness communities, a lot of that rhetoric, everything's fine, everything's high vibe, everything's, you know, wonderful. But as a person of color, as an Asian American, where our experiences are maybe a little different from everyone else, it's clearly not that. So can you speak a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think one other thing I just wanted to highlight before we go there is, I think another reason why I'm so vocal about disability is because I did so much research as to the intersection between being Asian and disabled. And at the intersection of that race and this disability identity, there is way more shame and way more taboo than I'm seeing in any other communities of color at the intersection of disability. And so if you look up the hashtag, like, I think it's like Black and disabled, you'll see like thousands of posts. Mm-hmm. If you look up the hashtag Asian and disabled, there are 6 posts.
Oh my God.
And it's just that because of the way that we were raised and this old tradition that if we were disabled, it meant that something was wrong with our family. It meant that something was wrong in our lineage, right? And so it was almost like we don't even breathe it into existence because of how shameful it is seen within our Asian family. So I just wanted to bring that up first. So then now we're talking about positivity and I think part of it, again, is very heavily influenced by being Asian. And what I mean by that is it's this idea that, why are you complaining about your mental health? Look at how hard your parents worked to get here. You shouldn't be complaining. You should be grateful for what you have. I mean, those were some of the messages that I internalized, making me diminish my experience. And I think what I've learned, and I've been spending so much time thinking about all of the things we say that diminish our experiences, right? When we say, oh, but I see all color. Mm-hmm. You're diminishing the experience that people of all different colors have, and all different races. When we say, oh, but you're so successful in spite of your disability. Like I'm still disabled. Like, by saying that I'm successful and being successful and being disabled are mutually exclusive. It's diminishing the impact that my disability had, right? And so again, I think for me, and you're totally right. I mean, I'm active on Clubhouse, and I go and I have been listening in to a lot of like different wellness practitioners and people sharing stories around healing and how much of it is a mindset shift. And it's all about the mindset. And the interesting thing about the mindset is that you have to believe it first.
Yeah.
Because if I'm going around being like, I'm great, I'm awesome, but I know deep down that I don't really believe those things, then there is some broken bridge that I'm not able to pass to get there. And, you know, I have been thinking a lot, but anyway, sorry. So the whole gist of the talk, so you don't have to watch it for 10 minutes, is that the secret to a fulfilling life is by embracing all of the aspects of who you are.
Mm-hmm.
And I learned that the hard way of trying to over-index on being super positive. I mean, even still, people are like, Tiffany, like you're, at least in my reflection of it, what I realized is that I spent a long time hiding behind my smile and telling people that everything was fine. And then, you know, come 2019, when I did get the PTSD diagnosis, some things were not fine. Yeah. You know, things were coming up and I was being re-triggered in ways that I couldn't control. And then I was like, you know, I think I need to acknowledge that I am not well. And it's okay to not be well, right?
Yeah.
But I needed to name, again, it comes back to, you know, not wanting to like be the trauma, but like I needed to name it to say, hey, there's something happening right now that, you know, when I am showing up at the doctor's office and I like all of a sudden burst out into tears, let me like, what is coming up inside of my body, maybe from my childhood, maybe from the way I was raised, that inner child Tiffany needs right now that is coming out in these emotional outbursts.
Well, that is the first step to healing, is you have to name the thing so that you can take the steps to heal. And what I appreciate what you just said is we came on and I asked you how you were doing, and because I'm an energy healer, so I could sense energy, and you were very honest with me. You were like, no, things aren't that fine because of your recent experience. And I appreciate that because it's helping me reframe how I show up when I'm not feeling good, when I'm not in a good space, that it's okay to be honest with somebody and trusting that they will hold the space for me no matter how I show up. So I really appreciate that. And before we get into your experience as an Asian American woman, what's more annoying, when people ask you where you're from or when they ask you about your arm or your hand?
You know, I'm excited that you reached out to me as a fellow Asian American woman, because it's actually not, I hadn't really thought that much about my race, to be honest. So I, and if you feel comfortable, I'm happy to share the experience I just had over the weekend. But a friend and I went to go hiking. I live in the Bay Area, hikes nature all around, all year round. And a car pulled up to our car, rolled down his window, and he shouted out of his window, "Go back to where you came from. We don't want you here." And I have been following all of the acts of anti-Asian hate over the past year, I guess it's been, even though this has been happening a long time, and it's never happened to my face. And I think that's why I was so shocked by it, because I know I'm Asian, but it's only until recently that I've been realizing that is what the world sees. So to be honest, I get the, hey, what happened to your arm, more than I get the, where are you from? And maybe part of that is because I live in the Bay Area, which is, you know, very at least I thought was very celebratory of Asian cultures. But I don't know if I would call it annoying. I think what I've been trying to remind myself of is that how can I treat every interaction I have as a reset? And what I mean by that is, maybe this is the first time this person's interacting with someone who looks like me in terms of race. Maybe this is the first time someone is seeing someone who has an arm that looks different. And again, it is emotional emotional energy that many of us don't have the energy to extend. But I come back to this reset of, let me see if I can use this as an educational opportunity to create a more compassionate world.
Wow. I wish I had that patience. And that's something that I'm working on myself, because the most annoying question to me, especially 2021, where it's like, hello, how could you ask these questions at this point in time? And I'm just trying to practice the patience of, like what you just said, this is an opportunity for me to show some compassion and some grace, but it triggers so much in me, this feeling of being an outsider, of not belonging, of being that weird one with the weird smelling food, you know, it just, that inner child again is like, freaking out. So
yeah, I mean, all of these are microaggressions. Well, it's interesting because when this incident happened, I put like a trigger warning on, and I was like, racist microaggression. And then I got some comments that were like, Tiffany, that's not a microaggression. A microaggression is, where are you from? That is like an outright aggression because he's saying you don't belong here, like get out. And I think when it touches on belonging, right, or saying something is wrong with you. So for me, you know, I think two of the comments that I've gotten the most, unrelated to my race, are, you should just cut off your arm, it's useless. And is there any surgery you can get to fix your arm? And I think what's interesting is, again, how, you know, and again, like my work is very much centered on being disabled, but I do have other identities. And it makes me think like, wow, when we assume that the default is to fix, right, is to fix my body, that is rooted in ableism, to say that my body, something is not okay with my body, right? And then when you are telling me that I should just cut off my arm, and again, like the number of times I have gotten comments like that, it did start to wear on me. Like I was like, in the beginning, I was very graceful. After a certain point in time, I was like, I can't do this anymore. And I had to take a couple days, like, and step away from it because it was a lot. It's overwhelming, right? And that's the thing with microaggressions, is that they become paper cuts. Yeah. You know, I'm sorry. The paper cuts become bigger wounds. The paper cuts become bigger wounds.
Who would even say that? That's what I'm like. I would never, even if I was thinking these horrible thoughts, which I don't, why? Like, I could never even think about saying that to another human being. That's what's like.
Yeah. But it's the same thing with, again, being Asian. Like who would think that it would be okay for someone to tell another person that they don't, that we don't want them here, you know, or to say like, why would we tell someone to go back to where they came from? Yeah. Like what level of hate is, and again, it's like this, I don't think this has anything to do with you and me personally as humans, which is why I think it becomes more infuriating to me, because this has nothing to do with me. It has more so to do with a society that's been built on upholding white supremacy. You know, I think it comes back to a white able-bodied, like white non-disabled supremacy, or white supremacy.
Wait, it's cis white male supremacy.
And I don't want to laugh. And you know, I go back and forth on this, which is, I often tell people that if you are uncomfortable with my disability, I would actually feel more comfortable if you said it out loud, even though it might hurt my feelings, because then we can use that as a launching off point to have a conversation. But again, if you are staying silent, because then we have this saying that we're like, well, if you're not going to say anything nice, just don't say anything at all. But what we're doing in to be nice is we're not acknowledging the all the ableist and sexist and racist systems that we're upholding. Right. So it's this double-edged sword that I'm still trying to figure out what the balance is, because I appreciate knowing that there are people who think that it's okay to make prescriptive comments about my body, you know, and can I use that as an opportunity to remind myself that not everyone sees the world the way that I do, and there's still more work to do.
Yes, there is. And I started doing my anti-racism work in 2018, and it really came to the forefront in 2020 when all the BLM stuff was happening. And I realized that spirituality and wellness, which is something that I'm very passionate about, it has to be rooted in social justice to allow everybody to feel safe, to allow everybody to feel seen and heard. And so I talk very openly about white supremacy and about dismantling these systems of oppression. So that's why I believe it's so important to amplify Asian American women voices, because the stereotype that I grew up with, at least, was that we're quiet and we're kind of obedient. We just work hard, study, go to, an Ivy League school and get married and have babies. But that's not how I became. That's not what I became. So I just really wanted to have you on as well, because you're an advocate for a group of people that I feel aren't represented at all. And even before we were talking, and again, when I was starting out with this anti-racism work, I made so many mistakes and I said the wrong thing and I felt ashamed, and I asked you if it was okay to say disability, because in my mind, that's such a horrible word. And you said, no, you have to say disability as a way of almost reclaiming that word.
I love that. You actually said it better than I did. But yeah, I mean, I think that we have so much fear around using a word that I think people have mistakenly come to believe means that we're broken or that we're less than. Mm-hmm. And I have spent a lot of time, in your anti-racism journey. I'm still on my anti-racism, anti-ableism journey of unlearning what I'm calling internalized ableism, right? Mm-hmm. The fact that I spent 12 years wearing long sleeves all the time, hiding my disability, not even giving it breath, it's rooted in shame.
Yeah.
And I appreciated that you asked the question, so that then you could just say disability on the podcast and it would be okay. But when we use euphemisms of it, like differently abled or unique abilities or special needs, it's reiterating a fact that we feel so uncomfortable with the word disability.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And when you said that, it made me realize that, because that's my own abled mind reprogramming that I have to do. When I see that word, I think of that blue handicap sign, or just one type of disability. But I really like the way you reframed my mind around that, which is probably gonna have to keep going, because unfortunately, we live in a society, as you know, that caters to abilities, like able-bodied. And everything I look at now, I'm like, oh my gosh, could a person who is visiting me, who was in a wheelchair, could even come into my house, and all of these things. And I was watching your reels on Instagram about being an ally, and every video I was like, oh my God, there's so much I have to learn.
Yeah. And there's so much I'm still learning too. And this is the thing, is that unlearning takes work. Mm-hmm. And part of this is what I call a pattern interrupt, relearning new habits, whether it's around our anti-racism journey or anti-ableism journey. And I came across this video. It was from another disability advocate named Amani Barbarin. And it was a TikTok stitch video that said, how do you say I love you in your language? And then she came on and she said, well, in disability, I love you sounds like I did research ahead of time and this place is accessible for you and your needs. And so I think the way you're thinking in terms of oh, would a wheelchair user be able to access my home? And if when the time comes, you can do the research and then tell your friend hey, I did the research and you can come over and I have been able to figure out a way to make this accessible for your needs.
Yeah.
And I just thought I just thought the video was funny, but it was so true, right? Which is, it's not so much fixating on the disability, but how can we make the environment inclusive and accessible so that people who have different types of disabilities or abilities are able to access things in the same way.
Yeah, and it goes back to a point we made earlier. It's just having more awareness and trying to see things from a different point of consciousness, to not just from your own lane, but seeing it from many different lanes. And I don't think that, similar to racism, I don't think you get to that point until somebody kindly or not kindly points it out to you that you have a blind spot, personally.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I love the tagline in your Instagram bio, which says disabled and well. What does that mean to you?
Yeah, I've started including that on different things. I grew up thinking that being disabled and being well were mutually exclusive. And what I mean by that is, and I have learned there's a difference between having a wellness practice and then the wellness industry. Mm-hmm. And so for me, it was really, what does it look like for me to live my best life with the cards that I've been dealt? Mm-hmm. And again, I think it was this messaging that just because you're disabled, you can't. And I think for me, including, and originally the line used to say, exploring what it means to be disabled and well, is I think it's this journey of, exactly as you said, right? We're always on this journey of healing. And I feel like I'm always on this journey of unlearning. Mm-hmm. How can I start to redefine what my life looks like as a disabled person on my own terms, mm-hmm. rather than all of the, ableist tropes that are being thrown my way?
Mm-hmm. That's beautiful. So you have a community called Diversibility and a podcast. Can you speak more about where people can find you? You're a 3-time TEDx speaker and you're a speaker. Where can people find you and hear you? And please speak more about Diversibility.
Sure. So Diversibility is something I started in 2009, back when I had that first aha moment to share my story. And what I was really curious about at the time when I started it was I was wondering if I could find other people who had stories like mine. And by meeting other disabled people, by rooting myself in a community, what I realized is that I could be proud in my identity. Like, how radical of an act is it to like myself? Mm-hmm. In a society that is telling me that I shouldn't like my body and I shouldn't like being a woman and I shouldn't like the color of my skin, And so now, fast forward 12 years later, the best way I describe Diversibility is we're on a mission to accelerate disabled lives through community, visibility, and engaged allyship. So one of the things that makes Diversibility unique is that non-disabled allies are welcome into our community because we want you to be witness to the conversations that we're having so that you can go out and be better allies. Because in our group, we're talking about dating, we're talking about home ownership, we're just talking about human things, right? I think that all of us have experience in. And I think that oftentimes we get so caught up in the diagnosis and what I call like the medical model, or what we call the medical model of disability, that it's like, what are all the intricacies that are happening in your body? When the real conversation is, how can we make this environment more accessible for all of us, right? It doesn't matter like what the name of your thing is, but how can we change our environment so that we're creating a world where everyone can share their gifts with the world. So I would encourage any of your listeners to join Diversibility. Come check us out. If you want to follow me, Tiffany, who started Diversibility, you can follow me across social media at I'm Tiffany Yu. It's the letter I, the letter M, followed by my first and last name. And most of my content, exactly like you said, Laura, is exploring what it means to be disabled and well. I talk about, I think mental health is and healing is a big part of the journey that I'm on. Acknowledging and taking accountability if I make mistakes, but also like balance and boundaries. And so that's what Tiffany is about. So So yeah, I'm excited to connect with your listeners and hopefully continue the conversation with you.
And she's on TikTok, and her TikTok's amazing.
Yeah, so TikTok is where I go. Actually, TikTok to me is like the epitome of like a version of being well. I talk a lot about, I call it PFJ, play, fun, joy. TikTok is where
it's my happy place. I love it so much.
There's some not so happy stuff happening on there as well, but that's where boundaries come into play. And I'm so grateful that we connected through TikTok. You know, I think there's an incredible creator community that's there who just wants to help each other, you know, achieve whatever goals we have on the platform.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Tiffany, for using your voice to help elevate this world. And thank you for being here.
Thank you.